Very few people on Earth could describe something like this for you from firsthand experience, but this person can. And I quote, "There is no such thing as a short phone call with Vladimir Putin." In the almost 3 years following Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in March 2014 and its invasion of eastern Ukraine, President Obama and the Russian president spoke over a dozen times by secure phone. A typical phone call lasted 90 minutes, prolonged by Putin's tedious monologues and the necessity of translation. The conversations typically began with a comical game of chicken, in which each side's communications staff tried to ensure that their leader was the last one to get on the line to start the call. Quote, "It was a game that Obama found ironic but not important, and he would simply busy himself with desk work or Scrabble on his iPad if Putin was slow to come to the phone." "Hello, Vladimir," Obama began. Putin responded, "Hello, Barack, how are you?" Their conversations, while sometimes pointed and often unsatisfactory in substance, were always civil and mostly respectful. Quote, "Despite the number of times the two engaged, they were unable to resolve our stark differences over Ukraine." That fly-on-the-wall perspective comes from a new book called Tough Love by Susan Rice. She served as National Security Advisor to President Obama, before that UN Ambassador. In her role as National Security Advisor, she was on those calls. And in addition to this being an legitimately inspiring and fascinating new book, there's nobody in the world I would rather talk to about what's going on in our world right now than her. Joining us now for the interview is Susan Rice. Ambassador Rice, thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be with you, Rachel. Thanks.
I want to talk to you about a million things. I do want to tell you at the outset that I found your book unexpectedly moving and inspiring, and it made me think harder about the way I work.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really...
I appreciate that.
I mean, you've done a lot of...
Coming from you.
Well...
Congratulations on your book, too.
Thank you very much. Mine is darker. Yours is more optimistic.
Well, that's an interesting contrast, given our respective roles.
Well, and our respective experience. I want to ask you about some of that experience, given what we are going through right now, because I think it's important for people to hear from you as a sort of grounding in normal governance in terms of how these things are supposed to be going. I know that you've said that you believe these impeachment proceedings are warranted, given the gravity of the accusations against the president. I also want to ask if you felt any differently about that over these past couple of days, as the president has started openly confessing to doing this, has openly confessed that he's doing it not only with Ukraine, but with China. And he's essentially daring people to hold him to account for it by saying that there's nothing wrong with what he's doing.
Well, personally, Rachel, I was not swift to come to the conclusion that an impeachment inquiry was justified. I had various reservations, but as more and more information has come to light, and in particular, what we learned in the last couple of weeks about Ukraine and now China, I don't see any alternative but to follow the inquiry and the facts where they go and then make a judgment. What we learned yesterday when the president stood on the South Lawn and said to the Chinese government that he wants them to give him dirt on Joe Biden, which, by the way, to my knowledge, doesn't exist, it was even more extraordinary than what we witnessed with respect to Ukraine, in my judgment, because China is our most formidable and committed adversary. And we are in the middle of a hot trade war and a very fraught security relationship where we're competing over the cyber realm and the South China Sea, over things like Huawei and the future of technology. And what President Trump in effect said before the whole world was, China, if you give me bogus dirt on Joe Biden, then by implication, I'm prepared to consider what kind of deal we can cut that you might be satisfied with respect to the trade war and our security concerns. He juxtaposed those things. And the Chinese aren't stupid. You know, yes, Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, said piously today, we wouldn't interfere in the American political process, and you poor people go sort yourself out.
Yeah.
The codicil to that is, you better not say a damn thing about Hong Kong, because we consider that our internal matter. So there's some leverage already, or Taiwan, which they, in opposition to U.S. policy, view as theirs as well. But the real concern, in my judgment, is that the Chinese understand two things. One, we've got a president who is incredibly unstable, unpredictable, and not on his game, if he ever was, and that this might be a moment, from their point of view, to try to steal second base from us, whether that's, again, in one of these conflict zones where our forces are potentially arrayed against each other, or in the economic realm or the cyber realm. But it is also the case that the Chinese might conclude that here's an opportunity to give Trump what he wants, provided we end this trade war on terms favorable to China. And so essentially what the president is doing is proposing, not very subtly, to sell out our farmers, sell out our manufacturing sectors, sell out the American taxpayers who've been paying for this stupid trade war with higher tariffs, and do it for his own personal political benefit.
When China said today, as you say, sort of piously, oh, no, you need to sort this out amongst yourselves, of course, we'd never do that. I saw that skeptically as well. It made me wonder, though, about whether or not essentially there is already operative, not hypothetically, but out there, an open invitation from the president that any government around the world that wants something in terms of U.S. policy or wants to take a bite out of America's hide in some way may see that a way to get that is by freelancing this, is by offering something to the president that he can use against his political opponents, whoever they are, whether it's made up, whether it's based in reality, that he's essentially opened a market for this stuff and has said that U.S. policy is on the line. Will other countries respond to that?
That's exactly what he's doing. He's putting out an open for business sign on the Oval Office, and he's in the business of trying to traffic in bogus dirt on his opponents at the expense of our national security and our national interests.
So if he is going to be impeached by that, very few people believe that he will be removed from office for that, so which means that he'll essentially be censured, and he'll be one of only 3 American presidents who's ever been impeached. But if he continues to do it, and if Republicans in the Senate continue to believe that he should stay in office while he does that sort of thing, what I want to know is there a way that we, the public, we the people, can harden ourselves as a target so that whatever the president is willing to do to our democracy and do to our country, inviting other countries to do what he's inviting them to do, is there a way that we can be resilient against that?
Yes. I mean, first of all, we have to vote. We have to participate in this process with all of our energy and all of our conviction, because it's not just an election that's at stake. I deeply, truly believe that the future and stability of our democracy is at stake. If we have 4 more years of a president that's basically putting us on the auction block for the highest bidder, who's prepared to do what he wants for his personal political or financial gain, then that's not a country we're going to recognize.
Well, voting out elected officials who don't hold them to account is a good idea. I'm worried, given the electoral map of the country, that it won't work, that the Republican-controlled Senate will still be the Republican-controlled Senate. I think I'm worried about the way that we, the public, were targeted in 2016. I worry about what our government did or didn't do, but I worry about the way that we, the people, we're targeted, and we're soft targets, and we're swayed.
Well, we're absolutely soft targets. And one of the very important messages I'm trying to convey in Tough Love is that our domestic political divisions are, in fact, at the moment, our greatest national security vulnerability. The Russians figured that out. They figured out that if they can pit people against each other on both sides of every divisive issue, whether it's race or immigration or guns or gay rights, if they can exploit those fissures which already exist and exacerbate them and cause us to question one another's loyalty and decency as Americans, then they don't have to fire a bullet to take us down. That's the risk we face. And so when you ask about resiliency, it's not just about voting. It's about being informed and educated. It's first and foremost about the American people understanding that our adversaries are trying to exploit these divisions, and that we, because we created these divisions amongst ourselves, have the ability to rectify them. The only good news about this is it's a problem of our own making, and therefore it's a problem we can solve if we're willing to listen to one another, to understand one another, and to change our system in ways that isolates the extremes and empowers the more moderates among us.
We're willing to grow up a little bit as a democracy.
Well, grow up is not just as a democracy, but as consumers of our political process. So right now, it's very easy, if you want to just get your news off of Breitbart or you want to just get your news off of BuzzFeed, to not listen to anything else and not talk to anybody who may have a different perspective and not question the veracity of the information that you're consuming. We've got to teach ourselves as voters, but even as young people and students, how to evaluate the truth of information, how to argue and debate and be open to alternative opinions. I mean, this is deep, and the remedies aren't going to be swift. And I even proposed some pretty dramatic steps like mandatory national service for Americans between the ages of 18 and 21. Spend 6 months or a year, every single one of us, working on something that serves the country, but that requires us to know and work alongside with and cooperate with people who come from vastly different backgrounds than we do. That's the kind of thing we need to be thinking about if we recognize that these divisions, which we are suffering from, which our adversaries are exploiting, are our potential death knell if we don't get it together. But, Rachel, after having said all that, which some people may find depressing, I do think it's worth recalling that as dark as this moment may seem to some people, and including to you and me, I imagine, we're old enough and we've studied enough history to recall that we've been through a whole lot worse than that in this country. We've been through a civil war. We've been through Reconstruction. We've been through the McCarthy era. We've been through Vietnam and the civil rights era where our cities were literally burning down and students were being shot on campuses. We've been through much worse and come out arguably stronger. And that's what this moment calls for.
Susan Rice is our guest. Her new book is called Tough Love, My Story of the Things Worth Fighting For. We'll be right back with her right after this. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.